Well, tonight the John Adams Institute is honored with the guest of Tucson, Arizona, Barbara Kingsolver. And I have to tell you, she was invited several times by the John Adams Institute, even before I was involved with it. And she accepted once last year, but unfortunately she couldn't come. I mean, she, right away mentioned it, so we never really told the audience, but we're very, very happy that she's here tonight. And she didn't come alone, she brought her whole family. And very warm welcome to you, but also very welcome to everybody here tonight. Before Barbara will talk on her latest book, she will talk about her latest book called Small Wonder. But also, that was all on the news cards and on the posters, on her latest translated novel, Prodigal Summer. And Prodigal Summer has been released this spring, and it is thanks to publishing house Prometheus, Bert Bakker, but also thanks to Penguin Books Benelux, that we are able to make this event possible. Jan Donkers, journalist, radio maker, and literary critic for the Dutch newspaper NRC, VPRO, will in a moment introduce Ms. Kingsolver. But before I ask him to do so, I want to tell you that there will be no intermission tonight, and following the introduction of Mr. Donkers, Ms. Kingsolver will have a talk for about 30 to 40 minutes about both books and maybe some more. And after that, both of them will take place on the stage and have an interview. And you'll also be invited to drop some questions if you would like, and you can use the microphones in the aisles. Ms. Kingsolver will sign her books later on, but before the time is there, I will be back to introduce something about our latest program this season, and I'll give you some extra info about that. May I ask you to switch off your mobile phones, refrain from smoking, and ask Jan to come and talk. Thank you.
We had fish for dinner, that's why. Ladies and gentlemen, the visit by our distinguished guest tonight, Barbara Kingsolver, more or less coincides with this is a sour note, I'm sorry, with the acceptance by the American Senate of a bill that will allow US troops to invade our country in the event the International Criminal Court, an institution, the creation of which was underwritten by 60 civilized countries, but not the US, and which has its seat in The Hague, might be so bold to indict an American citizen for supposed crimes against humanity. Baffled as you may be by this news item, you may still wonder why I bring this up, and whether this is not a little bit impolite in the presence of our American guests. The reason I bring this up is that it indicates that the disregard for the opinion of the international community, and for that of its own citizens, for that matter, held by the present American government, is even greater than we already feared it was. And precisely that is one of the many subjects that Ms. Kingsolver brings forward in her latest book, the just published collection of essays, Small Wonder. It is a wonderful book which discusses a wide range of subjects, from the above-mentioned arrogance of her government in what she calls one of history's darker moments, to the plight of the homeless, the need for biodiversity, the case against genetically altered food, and many other, sometimes lighter subjects. She has, of course, received hate mail because of it. She has been abused and called names. Her arguments have been twisted. She has been called naive, of course, that's most patronizing of all arguments, for suggesting that there are alternatives to war. At a previous occasion, during a previous international crisis, she was shouted at, "Hey, bitch, love it or leave it," and she decided, well, to leave it. She went to live in Spain, as you may have read in her work, for a while, but this time around, that is not an option. Still, I think it's good to know that dissent not only exists, but also comes in the shape of well-written and well-documented prose. But apart from being a courageous essayist with strong opinions, Barbara Kingsolver is first and foremost a wonderful novelist. Her debut, The Bean Trees, won her not only the respect of her former classmates, some of whom had, I understand, previously spurned her. Its reception also taught her two things. One, and I quote, is that attitude is the secret of writing. Hope, unyielding faith in the enterprise. If only I hold my mouth right, keep a clear fix on what I believe is true while I make up my stories, sure I will end up saying what I mean. And it taught her another thing about the power of fiction. More than one reader of this autobiographically inspired psychology of the underdog whispered to her, I know you based that insecure Luann character on me. Some biographical background. Barbara Kingsolver grew up in eastern Kentucky, and although the options were perceived to be very limited, grew up to be a farmer or a farmer's wife, she knew from her early youth that she wanted to be a storyteller. It was not her mother telling her a bedtime story, but the other way around. As a child, she wrote essays and stories and kept a diary, of course. Still, a career as a writer was immensely far beyond her thoughts, and she left Kentucky to study biology at DePauw University in Indiana, where she graduated in 1977. Since then, she worked as a journalist, an archaeologist, an X-ray technician, a house cleaner, and in numerous other jobs. We, her readers, should be immensely grateful for the fact that she began to suffer from chronic insomnia in the late 80s, because it was because of that that she started to write in those late hours when she was not supposed to wake up anyone. We owe the rest of her work partly to that. Barbara Kingsolver published 6 more books of poetry, fiction and non-fiction, but it was with the next one, the Poisonwood Bible, in 1998, that she reached the immense audience that she now enjoys. It is one of the books that I don't hesitate to call a masterpiece, this family saga that can be read at several levels, with its frightening description of the violence of African nature, of man's imperialist arrogance, of straining family ties, and, last but not least, of the Western world's implication in cold-blooded political murder. It was a world far removed from the Kentucky where she grew up, or the Arizona where she presently lives, and the book is one of the wonders of the power of human imagination, a story that will haunt you for a long, long time after you have finished it. That book will only be part of the subject of her talk tonight. She will mostly speak about her last essay collection and about Prodigal Summer, which appeared in Dutch translation under the title Zomer van overvloed. She will read from and talk about this latest novel, and which could not have been written without her background in biological science. Prodigal Summer is an extremely sensuous and sensual book, and the fact that her word processor does not recognize the words, as I understand, penis and coyotes, should not bother the reader at all. In this novel, 3 stories are interwoven, set in midsummer in the Appalachians. Stories about love, about human interdependence, and about the awareness that we humans are only part of life on this planet. And it is also a book about pheromones, about ecosystem, and about coyotes, the least understood and hated, most hated of American animals. It is in her descriptions of wildlife that Ms. Kingsolver in this book is at her best ever, maybe. And although she will read from the book herself, I won't let this chance pass by to quote my favorite passage, the last paragraph, about the nightly run of a female coyote. Please bear with me. If someone in this forest had been watching her, a man with a gun, for instance, hiding inside a cup of leafy beech trees, he would have noticed how quickly she moved up the path, attending the ground ahead of her feet, so preoccupied with a solitary search that she appeared unaware of his presence. He might have watched her for a long time, until he believed himself and this other restless life in his sight to be the only two creatures left, here in this forest of dripping leaves, breathing in some separate atmosphere that was somehow more rarefied and important than the world of air silently exhaled by the leaves all around them. But he would have been wrong. Solitude is a human presumption. Every quiet step is thunder to beetle life underfoot, a tug of impalpable thread on the web pulling mate to mate and predator to prey, a beginning or an end. Every choice is a world made new for the chosen. Miss Kingsolver describes herself as shy and only comfortable on the road in the guise of a reluctant rock goddess. Nevertheless, she will read from this latest novel and talk about it. Afterwards, as already Monique has told you, there's time for some questions, either by me or by you, the audience. You may ask her about pheromones and coyotes. You may ask her about Lumumba or special creation, or about the Bush government, which is hostile to the things she loves most. If you feel a bit apprehensive about standing up and phrasing your question in English from the floor, you may also write it on a piece of paper. And after her lecture, hand it to Henriette, who is over there, and she will give it to me, and I will phrase them. I'll try to phrase them in English. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure to present Barbara Kingsolver.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, wonderful audience. Thanks for coming here tonight. This is a beautiful church. You know, we don't have things this old in my country. It's remarkable to be here. I am here with my family. I like very much to travel with my family and to come here. Just to add a footnote to what Jan said earlier about my country's reluctance to accept the authority of the World Court of Justice. I would ask that if my country ever invades your country, I hope you will accept me as my petition for political asylum, because I would rather live here than there. It's not an easy thing, you know, to travel abroad in times like this when one's government is behaving in ways that do often seem shameful and juvenile, and at the very least not prudent or well thought out. But I also know that many of you are from the United States or know a good bit about the United States, and I want to tell you or reassure you of something that I think you already know, which is that the United States is a land of diverse cultures and a land of diverse opinions. So please do not be persuaded by a press of the moment that would try to convince you that all Americans think one way. You know that isn't true, and you know that there are a lot of us who are, I should say, on the same side you are, of a lot of questions of humane behavior and dignified and kind behavior in the world. We're doing the best we can. He doesn't always listen to us, but we do the best we can anyway. And I appreciate very much the opportunity to come here, not just to speak to you, but to learn from you. We're really enjoying our visit to Amsterdam. This is only our second day here. We're going to spend some more time, not just in the city, but out in the countryside. I love bringing my kids to Europe. I want them to grow up not just as citizens of the United States, but as citizens of the world, and to understand something about what that means. I have to apologize because, well, I know this is a forum that's generally held in English, and I'm grateful for that because I don't speak Dutch. And I am sorry, I know you're used to it. Nevertheless, when we travel abroad, we do try, and it's a little bit unusual for us to travel in a country where we really don't speak the language at all. In my family, we speak Spanish, and I speak French, and I can, sort of muddle through in Italian. And when we go to England, they mostly understand us there. We get by, but here we don't. So we're relying on your goodwill, which so far has been quite forthcoming. There are moments, though, that are interesting. Last night we were in a restaurant, and my husband went to the restroom, went down some little stairs. This is a city of stairs, little teeny stairs that go up and they go down. And he came back after a while, and he said, "Well, I couldn't tell which one it was." And I said, "No, it didn't say Damas and Herren." That's what I was kind of thinking. He said, "No, there were really long words." And I thought, well, this is curious. So I thought I would go investigate, and I went down the little stairs, and there was one door that said, "Nood Uitgang," and the other one said, "Geen Toesgang." And so I came back and I said, "Which one did you use?" So if you hear stories of Americans that are going to bathroom in the janitor closet, that would be us. But we're doing the best we can. I think what I'm going to do, rather than talk to you a lot about myself, because I was raised by a mother who always told me it's impolite to talk about yourself more than 15 seconds. So if you ask me direct questions, I'm allowed to answer, but I don't just like to go on and on about myself. That's not polite. But I would be happy to read to you from Prodigal Summer, which is just published in Dutch, and I'm very pleased about that. I'm delighted to see this novel, which at first glance, they sent a copy to my office, and I pulled it out of the envelope, and I said, "Oh, it's Summer on Overflow." No, Overload, that's it, Summer on Overload, that's what it looks like. It's, I think, a beautiful translation. I had lunch with the translators, and they convinced me of their, no, not that it was a beautiful translation. Well, they did, indirectly, because I asked them some questions about how, there was a particular sort of difficult double meaning of a word that I wondered if they had, noticed that. And I said, "What did you do about that?" "Oh, we spent a month on that," they said. And I was honored by the thought and care that they put into this translation, and I do trust it. You don't always know, your books go out in the world, and then you get a copy, of Poisonwood Bible in Hebrew, and you think, which end of this do you open? Which side of this? I will never know whether it's a good translation, but it's. I think this is a very nice one, and I hope you'll read it. Although here you are listening to me speak in English, so you probably read in English as well. But I will read to you a few sections from this book, and I think that for this, I'm interested in this John Adams Institute of American Culture here. It's very flattering, I guess, that you have that much interest in American culture, and I think this is an appropriate novel to discuss here because it is a particularly American novel. I think of all my novels, this one, because it celebrates wildness and the sort of the preciousness and value of the natural world, I think it makes me proud, I guess, of one of the things that I really do love about the United States and about North America, and that is that we still have wilderness there. We have enormous expanses of wild and uninhabited places. Now, you might say that that's just because we've only been there 200 years and we haven't had time to wreck it all, and you might be right about that, but not entirely. I think that as a nation, as a people, we did make a certain sort of decision in the early part of the 20th century about setting aside national parks and enormous, not just token areas of wilderness, but huge areas of wilderness. I think it is partly because the continent was settled recently enough that we sort of recognized we had a choice about this. It didn't necessarily have to, in the end, look like another Europe. It could look many different ways, and it could look like a place that had wild mountains in it and great stretches of deserts that are not inhabited. And so we did that, and we're fighting to keep it that way. It's not necessarily a done deal. There is a certain amount of pressure, to take those sacred places back and drill them for oil and so forth. But we're trying. And I think we do, in my country, appreciate wildness to some extent. I certainly do. And I think the reception of this book was heartening in that way. So I'll read to you from it a little bit. And I think that, and later on, if you'd like to talk more about sort of the politics of these things I've been discussing, or about my newer book, Small Wonder, which isn't published here yet, then I'd be delighted to address any of those questions you have. But for now, I'll just read to you a little from the very beginning of the book. I'll tell you something, too, about a little literary tidbit about reading Barbara Kingsolver, so that you'll all do very well on the test at the end of the hour. I have this belief that the first sentence of a novel should make a promise that the rest of the story will keep. It's not always the first sentence. It's sometimes the whole first paragraph, or it's somewhere near the beginning. But you also can be sure that if it's repeated in the last paragraph of the book, which was read to you earlier, then you know that was it. You won't miss it. So this is the beginning of chapter 1, which is called Predators. Her body moved with the frankness that comes from solitary habits, but solitude is only a human presumption. Every quiet step is thunder to beetle life underfoot. Every choice is a world made new for the chosen. All secrets are witnessed. If someone in this forest had been watching her, a man with a gun, for instance, hiding inside a copse of leafy beech trees, he would have noticed how quickly she moved up the path and how direly she scowled at the ground ahead of her feet. He would have judged her an angry woman on the trail of something hateful. He would have been wrong. She was frustrated, it's true, to be following tracks in the mud she couldn't identify. She was used to being sure. But if she'd troubled to inspect her own mind on this humid, sunlit morning, she would have declared herself happy. She loved the air after a hard rain, and the way a forest of dripping leaves fills itself with a sibilant percussion that empties your head of words. Her body was free to follow its own rules, a long-legged gait too fast for companionship, unself-conscious squats in the path where she needed to touch broken foliage, a braid of hair nearly as thick as her forearm falling over her shoulder to sweep the ground wherever she bent down. Her limbs rejoiced to be outdoors again, out of her tiny cabin whose log walls had grown furry and overbearing during the long spring rains. The frown was pure concentration, nothing more. 2 years alone had given her a blind person's indifference to the look on her own face. All morning, the animal trail had led her uphill, ascending the mountain, skirting a rhododendron slick, and now climbing into an old-growth forest whose steepness had spared it from ever being logged. But even here, where a good oak hickory canopy sheltered the ridgetop, last night's rain had pounded through hard enough to obscure the tracks. She knew the animal's size from the path it had left through the glossy undergrowth of May-apples, and that was enough to speed up her heart. It could be what she'd been looking for these 2 years and more, this lifetime. But to know for sure, she needed details. Now it would take more than tracks. And on this sweet, damp morning at the beginning of the world, that was fine with her. She could be a patient tracker. Eventually, the animal would give itself away with a mound of scat or something else, some sign particular to its species. A bear will leave claw marks on trees or even bite the bark sometimes, though this was no bear. It was the size of a German shepherd, but no house pet either. The dog that had laid this trail, if dog it was, would have to be a wild and hungry one to be out in such a rain. She found a spot where it had circled a chestnut stump, probably for scent marking. She studied the stump, an old giant, raggedly rotting its way backward into the ground since its death by axe or blight. Toadstools dotted the humus at its base, tiny ones, brilliant orange. The downpour would have obliterated such fragile things. These must have popped up here in the few hours since the rain stopped. After the animal was here, then, inspired by its ammonia. She studied the ground for a long time, unconscious of the elegant length of her nose and chin in profile, unaware of her left hand moving near her face to disperse a cloud of gnats and push away stray hair out of her eyes. She squatted, steadied herself by placing her fingertips in the moss at the foot of the stump and pressed her face to the musky old wood. Inhaled. "Cat," she said softly, to nobody. Not what she'd hoped for, but a good surprise to find evidence of a territorial bobcat on this ridge. This mix of forest and wetlands in these mountains could be excellent core habitat for cats. But she knew they mostly kept to the limestone river cliffs along the Virginia-Kentucky border. And yet here one was. It explained the cries she'd heard 2 nights ago, icy shrieks in the rain like a woman screaming. She'd been sure it was a bobcat, but still lost sleep over it. No human could fail to be moved by such human-sounding anguish. Remembering it now gave her a shiver as she balanced her weight on her toes and pushed herself back upright to her feet. And there he stood, looking straight at her. He was dressed in boots and camouflage and carried a pack larger than hers. His rifle was no joke, a .30-30 it looked like. Surprise must have stormed all over her face before she thought to arrange it for human inspection. It happened that she ran into hunters up here, but she always saw them first. This one had stolen her advantage. He'd seen inside her. "Eddie Bondo," is what he'd said, touching his hat brim, though it took her a moment to work this out. "What?" "That's my name." "Good Lord," she said, able to breathe out finally. "I didn't ask your name." "You needed to know it, though." Cocky, she thought, or cocked, rather, like a rifle ready to go off. "What would I need your name for? You fixin' to give me a story I'll want to tell later?" she asked quietly. It was a tactic learned from her father and the way of mountain people in general to be quiet when most agitated. "That I can't say," he said, "but I won't bite." He grinned, apologetically it seemed. He was very much younger than she. His left hand reached up to his shoulder, fingertips just brushing the barrel of the rifle strapped to his shoulder. "And I don't shoot girls." "Well, wonderful news." "Bite," he'd said, with the northerner's clipped eye. "An outsider. intruding on this place like kudzu vines. He was not very tall, but deeply muscular in the way that shows up through a man's clothing, in his wrists and neck and posture, a build so accustomed to work that it seems tensed, even when at ease. He said, "You sniff stumps, I see." "I do." "You got a good reason for that?" "Yep." "You going to tell me what it is?" "Nope." Another pause. She watched his hands, but what pulled on her was the dark green glint of his eyes. He observed her acutely, seeming to evaluate her hill-inflected vowels for the secrets behind her yep and nope. His grin turned down on the corners instead of up, asking a curved parenthetical question above his right-angled chin. She could not remember a more compelling combination of features on any man she'd ever seen. "You're not much of a talker," he said. "Most girls I know, they'll yap half the day about something they haven't done yet and might not get around to." "Well then, I'm not most girls you know." She wondered if she was antagonizing him. She didn't have a gun, and he did, though he'd promised not to shoot, or bite, for that matter. They stood without speaking. She measured the silence by the cloud that crossed the sun and by the 2 full wood thrush songs that rang suddenly through the leaves and hung in the air between herself and this man. Her prey? No, her trespasser. Predator was a strong presumption. "All right if I just follow you for a while?" he asked politely. "No," she snapped. "That wouldn't suit me." Man or boy, what was he? His grin dissolved, and he seemed suddenly wounded by her curtness, like a scolded son. She wondered about the proper tone, how to do that. She knew how to run off a hunter who'd forgotten when deer season ended. That was her job, but usually by this point in the conversation, it was over. And manners had not been her long suit to begin with, even a lifetime ago when she lived in a brick house neatly pressed between a husband and neighbors. She pushed 4 fingers into her hair, the long brown bolt of it threaded with silver, and ran them backward from her hairline to tuck the unraveled threads back into the braid at her nape. "I'm tracking," she said quietly. 2 people make more than double the noise of one. If you're a hunter, I expect you'd know that already." "I don't see your gun." "I don't believe I'm carrying one. I believe we're on national forest land inside of a game protection area where there's no hunting." "Well then," said Eddie Bondo, "that would explain it." Yes, it would. He stood his ground, looking her up and down for the longest while, long enough for her to understand suddenly that Eddie Bondo, man, not child, had taken off all her layers and put them back on again in the right order. The dark green nylon and Gore-Tex were Regulation Forest Service. The cotton flannel was hers, likewise the silk thermal long johns, and what a man might find of interest underneath all that, she had no idea. No one had been there in quite a while. Then he was gone. Birdsong clattered in the space between trees, hollow air that seemed vast now and suddenly empty. He had ducked head first into the rhododendrons, leaving behind no reason to think he'd ever been there at all. A hot blush was what he left her, burning on the skin of her neck. She went to bed with Eddie Bondo all over her mind and got up with a government-issue pistol tucked in her belt. The pistol was something she was supposed to carry for bear, for self-defense, and she told herself that was half right. For 2 days, she saw him everywhere. Ahead of her on the path at dusk, in her cabin with the moonlit window behind him, in dreams. On the first evening, she tried to distract or deceive her mind with books, and on the second, she carefully bathed with her tea kettle and cloth, and the soap she normally eschewed because it assaulted the noses of deer and other animals with the only human smell they knew, that of hunters, the scent of a predator. Both nights, she awoke in a sweat, disturbed by the fierce, muffled sounds of bats mating in the shadows under her porch eaves, aggressive copulations that seemed to be collisions of strangers. And now, here, in the flesh, in broad daylight, beside this chestnut stump, for when he showed up again, it was in the same spot. This time he carried his pack, but no rifle. Her pistol was inside her jacket, loaded with the safety on. Once again, she'd been squatting by the stump, looking for sign, very sure this time she was on the trail of what she wanted. And once again, as if her rising up from that stump had conjured Eddie Bondo, as if he had derived from the rush of blood from her head, he stood smiling at her. "There you are," he said. "Not most girls I know." Her heart beat hard enough to dim her hearing in pulses. "I'm the only one you know, looks like, if you'd be hanging around the Zebulon National Forest, which you seem to be." He was hatless this time, black-haired and just a little shaggy like a crow in the misty rain. His hair had the thick, glossy texture she envied slightly, for it was perfectly straight and easy and never would tangle. He spread his hands. "Look, Ranger lady, no gun. Behold a decent man abiding by the law." "So I see." "More than I can say for you," he said, sniffing stumps. "No, I couldn't lay any claim on being decent, or a man." His grin grew a shade darker. "That I can see." "I have a gun. He can't hurt me," she thought. But she knew, as she thought these words, that some other tables had turned. He'd come back. She had willed him back to this spot. Now I have to stop right there. For what comes next, I couldn't read aloud. But if you'd like, I'll read another section. It's a short little chapter, and I'll read it. It's about other people. This book is not just about Deanna and Eddie Bondo. It's about other people who don't even know Eddie Bondo and Deanna, but they live nearby in the same place. And they see some of the same animals and breathe some of the same air and drink the same water. But they're very different people, and this is chapter 6, which I'll read to you for no other reason than it's my favorite chapter in the book. It's called Old Chestnuts. Garnett could still remember from when he was a boy a giant hollow log way back up in the woods on Zebulon Mountain. It was of such a size that he and the other youngsters could run through it single file without even bending their heads. The thought made him smile. They had reckoned it to be theirs, for a 10-year-old boy will happily presume ownership of a miracle of nature and then carve on it with his knife. They'd called it by some kind of name. What was it? Something Indian. The Indian Tunnel. A surprising fact occurred to Garnett then, for the first time in his nearly 80 years. The unfortunate fellow who'd chopped down that tree, miscalculating its size and then having to leave it, must have been his grandfather. How many times before had Garnett stood right here at the edge of his seedling field, staring up at that mountainside, ruminating on the Indian Tunnel, but he'd never put the two facts together. That tree must have come down near 100 years ago, when his grandfather owned the whole southern slope of Zebulon Mountain. It was his grandfather, the first Garnett Walker, who'd named it. Who else could have felled that tree? He and his sons would have spent a whole day and more with their shoulders against the crosscut saw to bring down that giant for lumber. They'd have been mad as hornets then to find, after all their work, that the old chestnut was too huge to be dragged down off the mountain. Probably they took away tree-sized branches to be milled into barn siding, but that trunk was just too big of an old monster and had to be left where it lay. Left to hollow itself out from the inside till nothing was left of it but a game for the useless mischief of boys. Mules they had to use in those days for any kind of work that got done, mules or men. A tractor was a thing still yet undreamed of. A mule could be coaxed into many a steep and narrow place where a tractor would not go, it was true, but some things could be wrought with horsepower that were beyond the power of horseflesh. That was the lesson he was meant to draw here, God's purpose for these paired recollections of Grandfather Walker and the Indian Tunnel. If they'd had a logging sledge or a good John Deere, that tree would not have gone to waste as Boy Tunnel and Bear Den. Yes, sometimes horsepower can do what horseflesh cannot. That was just it, the very thing he had been trying to tell the Raleigh woman for years. Miss Raleigh, he'd explained until he was blue in the face as she traipsed through her primitive shenanigans. However fondly we might recall the simple times of old, they had their limits. People keep the customs of their own day and time for good reason. Nanny Land Raleigh was Garnett's nearest neighbor and the bane of his life. Miss Raleigh it was, and ever would be, not Mrs., even though she had once borne a child, and it was well known in Zebulon County that she'd never married the father. And that had been some 30 years ago or more, a far cry before the days when young girls began to wear rings in their noses and bells on their toes as they did now, and turn out illegitimate children as a matter of course. In those days, a girl went away for a decent interval to visit a so-called relative and came back sadder but wiser. But not Miss Raleigh. She never appeared the least bit sad, and the woman was unwise on principle. She'd carried the child right here in front of God and everybody, christened the poor thing with a ridiculous name, and acted like she had every right to parade a bastard child through a God-fearing community. And every one of them has forgiven her by now, he reflected bitterly, peering up the rise through the trunks of her lower orchard toward her house, which sat much too close to his own on the crest of a small flat knoll, just before the land rose steeply up the mountainside. Nanny was the sort. She could get away with everything, with anything. Every one of them just as pleasant as the day is long when they meet her out here in the lane. Nanny all rosy-cheeked amongst her daisies with her long calico skirt and braids wrapped around her head like some storybook Gretel. They might gossip some, for how could such an odd bird fail to attract the occasional sharp arrow let loose from Oda Black down at the Black store? But even the vociferous Oda would put a hand beside her mouth to cut short a remark about Nanny, letting the suggestion of it hang, but packaging it with deep regret. Nanny bribed Oda with apple pies. That was one of her methods. People thought she was comical and intriguing, but for the most part excessively kind. They didn't suspect her little figure of harboring the devil, as Garnet Walker did. He suspected Nanny Raleigh had been put on this earth to try his soul and tempt his faith into doubt. Why else, with all the good orchard land stretching north from here to the Adirondacks, would that woman have ended up as his neighbor? Her sign alone was enough to give him hives. For 2 months now, ever since she'd first crept over on his side to put up that sign, he'd lain awake nearly every night, letting it get on his nerves. Heaven knows it's one thing when a Hereford jumps a fence and gets over onto a neighbor. That a body can forgive and forget, but a 3-foot plywood sign does not get up and walk. Last night he'd fretted till nearly the crack of dawn, and after breakfast he'd made up his mind to walk out through his front seedling field to check the road frontage, looking for signs and wonders, as the Bible said, though Nanny's sign was known only for bad behavior. He could see it now through the weeds, the backside of it, poking up out of the bank above Highway 6. He squinted to make sure. His eyesight had reached the point where it required some effort. Yes, the lettered side was facing the road, but he knew what it said. The whole hand-painted foolishness of it, commanding the roadside, his roadside, 200 feet over his property line, to be a no-spray zone. As if all the person had to do to rule the world was concoct a fool set of opinions and paint them on a 3x3 square of plywood. That, in a nutshell, was Nanny Raleigh. His plan for today was to hoist that sign with a mighty heave back over her fence into the ditch, where it would be consumed by the swamp of weeds that had sprung up in the wake of her ban on herbicide spraying. Then justice would prevail in his small corner of God's green earth. He hoped she was watching. Garnet waded carefully down the embankment through the tall weeds and yanked up the sign with enough difficulty that he changed his mind and hoped she wasn't watching. He had to grasp it with both hands and wobble the stake for quite a long time to loosen it out of its hole. The woman must have swung a 4-pound mallet to drive it in. He was lucky she hadn't dug a post hole with her antique tractor and set it in cement. He could picture it. She had no respect for property, for her elders in general, or for Garnet in particular. No use for men at all, he suspected darkly. He began wading toward the property line, swishing and hacking a path through the weeds ahead of him with the sign. He felt like one of the knights of old, fighting his way through an army of foes with his wooden sword. The bank and road cut were in a hateful condition, just one long tangle of poke, cockleburs, and more. This was all Nanny's doing, his cross to bear. Everywhere else in Zebulon County, everywhere but here, the county road workers kept the road cuts mowed, or if the banks were too steep for mowing, like this one that fronted his farm, at least kept them sprayed. It took only one good dose of 2,4-D herbicide every month to shrivel these leafy weeds to a nice withered stand of rusty brown stalks, easily raked down afterward to show the world a tidy frontage. But instead he had this now, this tangle of briars harboring vermin of every kind known to man, breeding in here and getting set to invade his F1 chestnut seedling field. It would take him days to cut through all this with a weed eater or a mowing scythe, and he wasn't sure his heart could take it. In 3 short months, Garnet's farm, whose fields he kept neat as pickle once you got up past the road cut, had come to look like a disgrace to passers-by. Probably it was all they talked about down at the black store, that Garnet Walker was a lazy old man, when it was really none other than Nanny Raleigh, their dear darling friend, working in her unseen ways to ruin him. It had started back in April, when he left this steep weed patch to the county's boys for spraying, since it was a county right-of-way. The 1st of May, he'd done the same again. Both times, she'd snuck out here in the middle of the night before road spraying day, working in darkness like the witch she was, to move her sign over onto Garnet. Now it was the 2nd of June, and the spray truck must be due again soon. How could she always know when it was coming? Was that witchcraft too? Most people around here couldn't even predict when their own cows were going to calve, let alone prophesy the work habits of a bunch of county-employed teenage hoodlums wearing earplugs, jewelry, and oversized trousers. In previous years, he had talked to her. He'd had the patience of Job, informing her it was her duty to keep her no-spray zone, if she insisted on having such a thing, inside of her own legal property boundaries. He had pointed dramatically at their line fence and stated, for Garnet was a reader, "Miss Raleigh, as the poet said, good fences make good neighbors." She would reply, "Oh, people just adore fences, but nature doesn't give a hoot." She claimed the wind caused the weed killer on his side to drift over into her orchards. He'd explained it to her scientifically. One application of herbicide on my bank will not cause your apple trees or anybody else's to drop off all their leaves. Not to drop their leaves, no, she'd admitted, but what if some inspector came tomorrow to spot check for chemicals on my apples? I'd lose my certification. Garnet paused again to untangle the sleeve of his work shirt from a briar. His heart was pounding from the effort of bushwhacking through this godforsaken mess. Her certification. Nanny Raleigh was proud to tell the world she'd been the first organic grower to be certified in Zebulon County, and she was still the loudest one. 15 years ago, he'd assumed it was a nonsense that would pass, along with rock music and hydroponic tobacco. But that was not to be. Nanny Raleigh had declared war not only on the county's 2,4-D, but also on the 7-dust and other insecticides Garnett was bound and obligated to put on his own seedling trees to keep them from being swallowed whole by the army of Japanese beetles camped out on Nanny Raleigh's unsprayed orchards. There was no end to her ignorance or her zeal. She was the sworn friend and protector of all creatures, great and small, right down to the ticks, fleas, and corn maggots, evidently. But could she really be such a fool as to fear the certification men coming around to spot check her apples? That would be along the lines of the Catholics coming to check up on the morals of their pope. The organic certification men probably called up Nanny Raleigh for advice. He paused again to catch his breath. In spite of the cool day, he felt dark sweat spreading down his shirt from the armpits like a pair of fish's gills. His arms ached from thrashing the sign, and he felt a queer heaviness in his left leg. He couldn't see his feet, but could feel that his trousers were soaked up to the knees from all the dampness down in the weeds. It was practically a swamp. The briars had become almost impossible to get through, and he still had 20 yards to go to reach the line fence. He felt purely miserable and almost lost heart. But no, he wanted to cross over down here below the fence line and throw the cursed sign into her weeds, where it belonged. He decided to push on, 20 more yards. If only his poisons would drift over onto her trees. He knew very well, and had told her so, that without his constant spraying to keep them down, the Japanese beetles would overrun her orchards completely. She'd be standing out there in her calico skirt under leafless trees, wringing her hands, wondering what had gone wrong in her little paradise. Success without chemicals was impossible. Nanny Raleigh was a deluded old harpy in pigtails. He could see the fence now, the posts at least. His eyesight had clouded to cataracts so slowly that his mind had learned how to fill in details like fence wires, tree leaves, and the more subtle features of a face. But as he moved toward the property line, the sensation of heaviness in his left leg grew so unbearable he could hardly drag it. He imagined what he looked like, thrashing and staggering forward like Frankenstein's monster, and embarrassment washed over him, but then was replaced suddenly by a terrifying thought. He was having a stroke. Wasn't that a symptom? Heaviness in the left leg? He stopped to mop the sweat off his face. His skin felt clammy, and a sick ache gnawed at his stomach. Dear Lord, he could fall down into these weeds, and who would find him here? After how many days or weeks? His obituary would read, "The decayed body of Garnett Walker was discovered Wednesday after the first frost brought down the weeds along his frontage on Highway 6. His chest felt constricted like a bulging tree trunk, wrapped too tightly in barbed wire. Oh, sweet Jesus. Through his ragged breathing, he cried out in spite of himself, "Help." And there she came down the embankment. Of all God's creatures, he had summoned to his aid Nanny Raleigh, wearing a pair of dungarees and a red bandana around her head like that woman on the syrup, Aunt Jemima. She came tearing out of nowhere, sliding down toward him, still carrying something in her hand from whatever home remedy she'd been out messing with. Nanny with her traps to catch codling moths, as if that would settle everything. It looked like a yellow paper box with the bottom cut out. Here I am, thought Garnett, at the end of my allotted days, staring at a yellow paper box with the bottom cut out. My last view of this earthly life, a bug trap. Dear Lord God, he prayed silently, I confess I may have sinned in my heart, but I obeyed thy fifth commandment. I didn't kill her. She had already grabbed him under his soggy armpits and was struggling him up the bank toward the flat ground of her front orchard. He had never felt her touch or her grip before and was shocked by this little woman's strength. He tried to help with his useless legs, but he felt as if he were participating in the sport of alligator wrestling and knew with a sinking heart that he was the alligator. Then, at last, he was lying on his back on the grass underneath her wine saps. She knelt over him, peering down with concern, and he gasped at the sight of her red bandana-crowned head reeling wildly through space. He quickly turned his head to the side. It always made him dizzy to lie flat on his back. "Miss Raleigh," he said weakly once the spinning of the world had ceased, "I don't like to trouble you. You go on with your business. But maybe if you get a chance directly, you could call up the ambulance. I think I've had a stroke." He closed his eyes. When she didn't answer, he opened his eyes and saw that she was staring down at his left leg in apparent horror. He felt confused. Would there be blood with a stroke? Or some kind of deformity? Surely not, but he couldn't make himself look. "Mr. Walker," she said, "you haven't had any stroke." "What?" "You haven't gotten a stroke. You've gotten a turtle." "What?" He struggled to sit up. Suddenly, his chest felt better, and his head was perfectly clear. "Look, you've got a snapping turtle hanging onto the side of your boot. I bet that thing weighs 15 pounds. Garnett was embarrassed beyond speech. He stared down at the monster in its dark, humped shell, a slime-green creature that had sprung from some other part of God's mind, certainly, than most. It had gotten hold of the edge of his leather sole with the vice grip the snapping turtle is famous for, and true to its fame, it appeared to have no plans on letting go until Zebulon County got thunder. Although it did seem to Garnett that its dark little beady eyes were looking up at him fairly sheepishly. Poor thing, thought Garnett, to have to commit yourself so hard to one moment of poor judgment. In a springtime as rainy as this one, snapping turtles strayed from their home ponds into wet ditches, looking for new places to find their hideous mates and breed their hideous children. Of course, there would be one waiting for him in the weedy ditch under all those briars, that swamp that had been created by Nanny Raleigh. And if he happened to have a turtle on his foot now, it was entirely her fault. "Well, I knew that," he said, waving offhandedly at the giant turtle. "I just wasn't feeling well of a sudden. But I'm better now. I'll just go home by the road, I think." She screwed up her face, shaking her head. "Not till I get that dinosaur off your heel. Let me go get a stick and whack it to make it turn loose of you." "No, really, you don't have to." "Oh, Mr. Walker, don't be ridiculous." "Well, Miss Raleigh," he snipped, "I can't feature it, knowing what a soft spot you have in your heart for pests and vermin." "You don't know the half of it, Mr. Walker. I've had a grudge against snapping turtles ever since that big monster in my pond ate the feet off one of my ducks. There's nothing I'd rather do than bang this old bastard's brains out." She peered down at Garnett, who winced, both at her foul language and at her manner. "But you'd better take off your boot," she added. "I couldn't be held responsible." "No," he cried, gaining control of the situation. Her hands had felt so strong, guiding him up the bank like the grip of destiny itself, like the claws of a she-bear. Having those hands on him once was enough for today. He wasn't going to undress for her. "No, now," he told her sternly, "there isn't any call to take out your grudges on this old fellow. He and I will just head back home now." "You will," she said. "Yes, I thank you for your help." Garnett got to his feet as gracefully as possible, considering, and limped down Nanny Raleigh's gravel drive toward the road. The lopsided scrape of his walk sounded like a car with a flat tire. Now he would have to hike 100 yards up the road to get to his own driveway and pray to the Lord no one came driving along at that moment to see Garnet Walker transporting 15 pounds of turtle up Highway 6 in a previously unheard of fashion. He turned sideways to cast a glance back. She just stood there in her bandana and rolled up dungarees, frowning, with her pale, skinny little arms crossed tightly against her blouse. She was quite put out with him, it seemed, or else she was making up her mind that he was crazy as a loon, one of the two. It made no difference either way to Garnet Walker. "Oh," he said suddenly, for he'd nearly forgotten the whole business. He turned back toward her, tilting his head a little to the side. "I'm afraid your no spray sign landed somewhere down there in the weeds at the bottom of the road cut." Her glare dissolved to a happy beam he could see plainly, for it lit up her face like sunshine on Groundhog Day. "Don't you worry, Mr. Walker. The spray truck went by at 7 o'clock this morning." Thank you very much. I guess now we will not have an intermission. We will just sit down at this table and we'll have a conversation.
I'll have some more water too.
Yeah.
That was wonderful. So as I said, if you have any questions that you want to be collected in the written form, please hand them over to Henriette. I was glad that you read a substantial part from Prodigal Summer. There's not really a main character in the book. It's 3 stories that, thank God, don't intertwine and don't coalesce. And if there's a red thread, then it's, well, I would say the den of coyotes in the book. I remember very vividly on a trip in the Texas Hill Country with my girlfriend a couple of years ago, seeing a freshly shot coyote about this high being nailed to the gate of a Texas ranch. It was still steamy, and the fur was still very, oh, this is horrible, but the fur was still very bright, shiny. So not only it had to be killed, but it had to be displayed. What is it with Americans and coyotes?
Well, I would take one step back and say, what is it with you Europeans and wolves?
Okay.
I mean, I don't take full responsibility for this problem. The fairy tales we read to our children, which came directly from Europe,
absolutely.
Always have the same villain. It's the big bad wolf. It is natural, I think, considering our history, our agrarian history, for humans to both fear and despise our principal competitors for our food, our hoofed food, which would have been bears and wolves. And in the New World, in addition to bears and wolves, coyotes. Coyotes are a predator that's doing very well in North America. In fact, there are more coyotes in North America than there ever have been in the history of the planet, and their range has spread into areas where they never were historically, even before Europeans arrived. And there are a number of reasons for that, but one of them is that we've removed the wolves, which ate the coyotes, and were predators of the coyotes, which just kind of goes to show you that we really aren't in control of this show, however hard we try. But there is a very deep-seated hatred that I do think is it's rooted in our fairy tales, and in I think there's almost a universal dread, a human dread and fear of large carnivores. In Africa, I think large snakes are dreaded in a similar way. and probably killed and displayed on trees in the same way. It's this sort of primal thing to say, got ya, you know. And it's taking a long time for us to, this sort of hatred of predators is obsolete now. It has been obsolete for a really long time. We're not really competing with the big bad wolf anymore for our food.
But it still persists in a way.
It persists in our folklore and in our modern culture because it's very hard to change these things around. It takes new stories and new mythologies to replace the old ones. And I believe that there's a great need in our culture and in, you know, Western culture in general for new myths that are more appropriate to our times.
Yes, because even Diana thinks that maybe in one of her musings about, she's tracking the coyotes for her research, right?
Yeah.
The research about their habitat, etc., etc. And she said, well, maybe the farmers are right in shooting them.
Well, because in some sense they don't belong there. They're new. They're an invasive species in the same way that honeysuckle and kudzu are. I don't know if that means anything to you. I'm sure you have invasive species here that are...
Honeysuckle, kamperfoelie, ik weet het niet precies. Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, in some ways the coyote could be perceived as an exotic species that's coming in, but in another way, I mean, many biologists, not just the fictional Diana, but many real biologists believe that the coyote is spreading into new ranges because it's moving into the niche of the eastern red wolf, which was a small wolf that ate the same food and sort of inhabited the same role in its ecosystem as the coyotes do now. So it's sort of an opportunistic species. But on this subject of new myths replacing the old, I guess I'd just like to mention that my newer book, which I haven't really talked about yet, my collection of essays, which came out in the U.S. in April, so it's still brand new. Small Wonder.
It is out here in English.
The Faber, the British edition, is out here. I open that book, the opening essay, the title essay, Small Wonder, begins with a story which I found in the newspaper and which I just loved because it is it's a new story that sort of has the potential of replacing our old mythologies. It's a story which you probably heard here too, or read here, about a small child, I think a toddler, an 18-month-old child in Iran, in the province of Loristan in Iran, that wandered away from a rural village of nomads, and it was lost for 3 days, and parties of people went out looking for it, and after 3 days they found this baby in the cave of a bear, and it was being not only protected and kept warm by this mother bear, but nursed. It was suckling milk from this mother bear. This is a true story. It's a kind of a miracle. And I loved that story not just because it's amazing and it really happened according to many witnesses, but because it gives you it gave me a whole new way to think about who the enemy is really. I mean, salvation may lie in unexpected places, and the thing we fear most may contain our salvation. I really love parables like that.
And what struck me is talking about enemies is that you write that you elect to believe that the people who discovered the bear suckling the baby did not kill the bear.
Right, I will never know. I followed this. Yeah,
exactly.
I followed this story back on the internet as far as I could go, and then I couldn't go any farther because I don't read Farsi or Arabic. That's even worse than my Dutch, is my Farsi, and so I couldn't really find out anymore. And so I had to stop, and I had to sort of cast this as a parable for the opening of my essay and my book. But I decided if I'm going to tell the story, I can tell it my way, and I decided to say they didn't kill the bear.
Okay.
They left some acorns a little pile of acorns outside of its cave, and said,
"Let's all
praise
elect
Allah."
to believe.
Yeah.
I'm going to embarrass myself in this overwhelmingly female audience by
I see a lot of men out there, by the way. Thank you for
Steve
coming.
is there.
No, I saw quite a few coming in.
by rephrasing a question that we talked about
Okay.
this morning and give you the opportunity to explain something that I, well, maybe misunderstood. There are three stories in not interlinking, but intertwining stories in Prodigal Summer. And at a certain point I wondered, why are in all three stories the women the persons who are telling the uninformed male about the lessons of biodiversity and the ecosystem?
Well, I was surprised when you asked that question because I didn't really think of it that way.
You're more surprised that I repeated it.
Right, yeah, even more surprised. I answered that question once. I thought I told you. No, weren't you listening?
I was. But there was no audience.
No. This is a book. This is not a book about who's right and who's wrong. It seems I never write books like that. I don't know how. In this book, it's true that there are these three separate stories are really three ongoing arguments. One between Deanna, who's the forest ranger, and Eddie Bondo, who carries a gun. He turns out to be a coyote killer, and they find ways to carry on their conversation that are very creative, and they never really convince each other of anything. And Eddie Bondo, I thought he was a very sympathetic character. He has his position, and you really understand it by the end. You know why I hope, you know why he feels the way he does. I mean, he does represent this sort of primal hatred and this primal desire to protect his territory and his sheep. He comes from a family of sheep herders, and
to leave his scent marks on this territory as well.
And yeah, he leaves his scent marks on Deanna's territory in his own way. I didn't really think of her as I don't think she ever changed his mind about anything. I think they did learn a few things from each other, but that's one conversation. And the second conversation or argument is between Lusa, who's trained as a biologist, and her farmer husband, who likes to go around cutting down all the, brush or clearing the brush around their farmhouse. Cole loses the argument promptly because I'm not giving away anything beyond the first chapter. He dies right away in the novel. He's gone. So, that's really inconvenient for his side of the argument. But interestingly enough, in the course of the novel, she slowly comes to understand he was right about a lot of things, that she had a sort of a condescending city person's attitude toward what is practical and possible for a farmer to do. And because she inherits the role of farmer, of having to make a living on this land, she learns that he was right. I mean, I think she gets a major comeuppance in the novel more than any. I think all the women in this book sort of learn. Their positions shift, and they learn they were less right than they thought they were. Garnet and Nanny. Garnet, I mean, don't you love Garnet? Come on. He's really my favorite person in the novel. Never mind that he's a fundamentalist, crotchety old fart. I just love him. And he has his position as well. I mean, all of these guys are representing legitimate points of view, which are, I mean, in some ways they're representing the mainstream view of our culture, and it was just an accident. I mean, the gender thing wasn't something I thought about a lot. It really just more or less fit their roles. I mean, if you reverse either one of them, Coyote Hunter Deanna meets, gentle Eddie Bondo. Does that work? I mean, come on, tell him. Does that work?
Okay, tell me. Okay, there won't be a third time.
Okay.
What shall we do? I'd like to go on to the Poisonwood Bible, but yeah, let's do that. Since you gave away a little tidbit of your working formula, so to speak, always start with a first paragraph that sets the tone.
Makes a promise.
Yes, it makes exactly. Well, this is not a tidbit that relates to my question about the Poisonwood Bible. The Poisonwood Bible is written so convincingly that it is almost impossible to believe that there are no autobiographical elements in there. And I hate to put this, I hate to be asked that question, so you can imagine how much I hate that question. But how did you document yourself for this book? Because I know that you were not there at that period.
Right, it couldn't have been autobiographical. At that time in history, I was barely, I don't even know if I could talk yet. I was really too young to know what was going on at that time. I did live in the Congo later, in the 60s, under very different circumstances, I'm happy to say. And it is important to me personally to stress that this is not an autobiographical book because, I like my father. I like my family. They're very nice people. And, I'm sure they get tired of people looking at them thinking, I wonder if he's the bastard, And people do, this is not the only, every one of my novels is presumed to be autobiographical, and I keep thinking, they can't all be, me. I haven't done all those things, I haven't been all those people. And I don't, it's not that I don't like to write autobiographically. I don't like to because it doesn't seem right to me to use people I know, in that sort of parasitic way to sort of steal their lives and put them in my books. I know plenty of people do. I'm not that kind of a person. Moreover, I wouldn't know how to do that. It's not the way I work. I don't begin with character or incident, which it seems to me you would have to do if you based your work on real people. I begin with theme. I start with a question, some really big question, like, what is it that the West did to Africa, in the middle of the last century, and how do we live with that? What kind of legacy is this, sort of this post-colonial treachery, and what does it mean for us? How do we live with that? I begin with a question like that. And then I start to think about how to answer it. I think, well, there's not one answer to that question. That would really be insulting to my readers to suggest that there is only one way to think about that, or one way to sort of absorb it into our lives and take it forward with us into, our next phase of history. I think there are many answers to that question.
So that's why you invoked a multitude of characters. Exactly.
I thought there's a continuum of ways to think about this, all the way from, on the one hand, a completely irresponsible answer of saying, what, me worry? I didn't do it. I was just trying to keep my hair combed. And so I invented a character to sort of represent that view, the daughter Rachel.
Yep.
And on the other end of the spectrum is a sort of the possibility of feeling so paralyzed with guilt that it is really impossible to move on in any way. And that position is represented by Orleana. And then in between there are these other ways of sort of invoking a scientific analysis of it, a sort of a political activist analysis, or a sort of a more spiritual answer. And so each of those positions was represented by a character who told her own version of the story. So I knew from the beginning that I was going to tell this novel in the voices of those 5 characters. Seems like that's not exactly what you asked me.
Well, no.
Oh, how did I research it?
That, but another thing that's now that you mention it, looking at the way the West has behaved in Africa. There is a fictional story that is on the foreground in your book, but there is a historical story in the background, which until recently was hardly known, I think, in the United States. Only now, with the release of certain CIA documents, I think, and with the release of a movie about the death of Lumumba, it's better known. By the time that you were writing this, there was hardly anything known about.
None.
None.
None. I would
Period.
say, right. And in fact, when I was working on this novel for truly several decades. Actually, one of those decades I was mainly putting off writing this novel, thinking I'd really like to, but I don't want to start yet. But, I was thinking about it and collecting. I had a file cabinet called the Damn Africa Book that I kept putting
Great
stuff
title.
in. Yeah, the Damn Africa Book. Because it was sort of, it was too scary. It was such a big project. I was really afraid of starting it because I was really afraid of failing to do it justice. So for a long time I collected information, and then I began slowly to write. And it was a long process of first sort of working out the plot, developing these different characters. I worked for almost a year just on refining their voices, so each one of them would sound distinctly separate from each of the others, so you wouldn't be confused, so you wouldn't read this book and say, now who's talking to me? I wanted you to know. I wanted it to be, even though it's a challenging book in that it's enormous and it's morally challenging. It's asking you to sort of face and think about some difficult things. But I don't think any book has to be difficult to read. I really believe in the gift of accessibility of a book that's enjoyable to read, even if it's hard to hard on some other levels. So I was doing all those things, and while I was working on the book, I was doing all kinds of sort of research on sort of background research, and I believed that my most difficult task, all this while when I was working on this book, would be to convince my readers that this really happened, that President Eisenhower, our dear President Eisenhower, that people really still think was such a good guy, met behind closed doors with the CIA and said, okay, this guy, the first democratically elected president this country has ever had, we're going to kill him. I thought, they'll never believe this. And that, in the rest of the story, it's, talk about horrible fairy tales. The Brothers Grimm could not have done any better or any worse than the story of the Congo in the middle of the last century. All the sort of dark dealings that were done there, and the installation of Mobutu, and then what the monster of Mobutu came to be. The pure, unadulterated exploitation of his country for some 30 years. I thought, no one's ever going to believe this. And lo and behold, in the few months before publication, the whole story kind of came alive. Mobutu suddenly was in the news after, nobody had heard of him for like 20 years. He certainly had not appeared in our newspapers.
Oh, he had
Suddenly,
been there,
he was there, but
the lion's cap and stuff.
yeah. Oh, yeah, he was there, but we weren't aware of his presence. And suddenly it was big news, and all kinds of things started happening in the Congo, and suddenly people were saying, oh, you've written a very topical book. And I said, oh, haven't I, though? I started 20 years ago. And good planning. And even, it was extraordinary. Some things, like I wrote in the novel about the death of Mobutu some 5 months before he died. And then I picked up the newspaper one day and read about the death of Mobutu. I read the details of the death, then I went back and read the scene I had written 5 months earlier, and I didn't have to change anything. I thought, wow, this is some power. Who's next?
In your opinion, did the diffusion of that information by your book and by other media, did it do anything to change the attitude in American?
I think so.
You did, yeah?
I do. I do think so. I think the story. I'm not going to take credit because I'm much too modest of a person to do that. I don't. I think a lot of things happened to sort of. It was a historical moment, and a lot of things came together. A book that came out by chance the same time as mine. That I thought was wonderful was a nonfiction book by Adam Hochschild, called Leopold's Ghost, right, thank you. Which was a nice sort of bookend. He sort of covered the first half of the century, and then the Poisonwood Bible covered the second half. Neither of us knew that we were, the other had been working on these books, and it was really, I think, I don't take credit for changing, the American mind, much as I would love to do that, but it was a moment of history when a lot of, a moment in our recent history when many things came together. I do think there is a new awareness in the United States of a willingness to accept that there's treachery in our past, that we've been much too naive to think about or believe. I think people are taking a new look at what happened in Chile, the assassination of Allende and all of that, which, of course, the CIA was also very involved with. And Guatemala.
And the Dominican Republic.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely. I mean, this whole litany of dark stories, and Fidel Castro, for heaven's sakes. I mean, they've been trying to kill him for 30 years. It's amazing. I think that there is a new willingness to believe in these things, and I do think in recent events, of last fall, with the sort of new, sort of shocking recognition in the United States that there are people out there who really hate us. I think there is a sense in many, many people's minds of why that might be. Of course, there is not one reason. There are millions of reasons, and there are certainly people who hate my country for reasons that, I think are inappropriate or illegitimate, but there is sort of a rage, a sense of outrage in the world, not just against the United States, but a sort of growing desperation over this gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the sort of disregard for the continuing growth of that gap that I think a lot of us feel very uneasy about. I think it's a new era.
Did you conceive of this Small Wonder as a book after the events of September 11?
Yes, I did.
That was the plug, so to speak, for you to, and reactions to it.
Yeah, it was. That was a terrible time, for not just in my country, but and not just in the world, but in my household. It was terrifying for us, and a very dark time, and very frightening time for us to think suddenly in a new way about the level of animosity and the forms that it could take. And I was asked immediately by a number of newspapers to write a reaction. Well, when you ask a novelist for a reaction to something that enormous, sit down, wait a while for the answer. I began to write, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote, and in some ways the writing was something I felt I could do. I think a lot of us felt like we have to do something. It felt like the world was ending in a certain way, and it was my way of giving blood in a crisis. I wrote and I wrote and I wrote because often on many days it seemed the only alternative to just weeping or falling apart over the fact that things are this bad in the world. And so I was writing just because I kept being asked by editors at different newspapers to contribute something to their op-ed pages, and then some people in my life, specifically my editor at HarperCollins and my agent, whom I respect very much, suggested to me that as long as I was doing all this writing, I make a book. And first I said, oh, no, I can't do that. And then, like 2 days later, I said, oh, well, okay. You have to think about it for a while. But it seemed like a good time. The essays were not all written since last September. Some of them were written earlier, in the previous 3 years, I guess. It's been about 5 years since I my previous collection of essays.
High tide in Arizona.
High tide in Tucson, right.
Tucson.
And yeah, that's okay. People call it everything. Surf's up in Tucson. A guy on TV on a TV talk show said that, and I had to just not go.
Well, that's a wonderful title for a song.
Yeah, Beach Boys. My titles have a knack for getting, I don't know, there's something about them, cognitive. Yeah, my aunt one time wrote to tell me how much she loved pigs in a blanket, and it's my aunt. So doesn't bother me anymore. So anyway, so it had been 5 or 6 years since my previous collection of essays, and I had a few, sitting around, and I had a lot more fresh ones, and then I thought, well, I could rewrite the old ones and kind of put them all together in a thematically coherent way, and this would be a good time to put together a collection of essays asking questions of myself and my countrymen about what it means to be a citizen of the United States and a citizen of the world in this moment that seems to us a very critical moment. An examination of the ways we are living and the consequences of how we live and where we might go from here.